All right, back again to finish up the chapter that we started last time from the biography of Gordon H. Clark, the Presbyterian philosopher. I'm rocking my New Mexico shirt, where I, a couple months ago, visited our new Bible Presbyterian church in Albuquerque, a church that came over from the PCA like my church did. And so, very glad to see people making that wise decision. I know some PCA folks wouldn't agree, but it's nice to be in a denomination where we don't have to fight those battles against liberalism, which have been fought in the PCUSA and now in the PCA. And again, I know the PCA folks wouldn't be happy with that. When I was once at a PCA presbytery and mentioned liberals in the denomination, someone got very upset with me. It turns out he was a liberal and didn't like the term, but it was true, and I now believe that, or continue to believe that there are, in fact, liberals of assorted stripes in that denomination. So we should be praying for them. But let's return then to the biography, and we'll see that there's been struggles in denominations, even some of the best ones like the OPC. We'll see as we continue in this chapter on the continued controversy and its results. We are now to Samuel Allen's 7 letters on page 149. And I think I mentioned a little bit about Samuel Allen there, so I won't try to add anything to it, but we'll jump right in. As the controversy spread to other areas of the church, the resistance movement made plans for a final stand at the General Assembly. This stand was organized by the Reverend Samuel J. Allen. If Samuel Allen is remembered at all today, it is as the minister of the congregation in North Dakota, which J. Gresham Machen was visiting when Machen fell ill and died on the 1st of January, 1937. Allen's involvement in the Clark ordination controversy had been fairly limited until he sent 7 letters to the ministers of the OPC, and perhaps to laypersons as well, explaining his view on the current state of the church and severely critiquing the WTS faction. Allen's first letter, called Teach, Evangelize, Contend, April 14, 1947, praised the OPC for being a great church, but ended with a suspense-inducing question to be pondered until his next letter arrived. The question he posed was simply, what is the primary cause of the division? Allen's second letter, Cause of Division, April 21, 1947, again praised the greatness of the OPC for its emphasis on doctrine in a non-doctrinal age and for its opposition to modernism. Returning to answer the question posed in his first letter, Allen wrote, "The chief cause of division in the OPC is the opposition of many ministers and laymen to the leadership of the professors of Westminster Seminary. The professors have a very definite idea of what constitutes the Reformed faith and practice. The professors have looked upon anyone who veered from their conception as not being truly Reformed. The list of those who are considered as not truly Reformed has grown throughout the years. It includes men who have given their time, energy, and lives for what they considered the Reformed faith. Such men were and are barred from teaching at Westminster Seminary, or being members of its board of trustees, or having anything to say about the editorial policy of the Presbyterian Guardian. This list includes Carl McIntyre, Alan McRae, Charles Woodbridge, Carrie N. Weisiger, who left our church, and Robert Strong, Clifford Smith, Gordon Clark, Edwin Ryan, Floyd Hamilton, the writer, and probably the majority of the ministers in the OPC." End quote. Allen's third letter, Forthrightness, April 28, 1947, continued. If the issues raised are not principal, but matters upon which truly Reformed people can and do differ, then the professors are not forthright, but schismatic. There have always been men in truly Reformed churches who have opposed premillennial doctrine very strongly, who have opposed what they consider a piety not taught in Scripture, who have opposed an emotional type of evangelism, which they thought minimized the importance of sound doctrine, and who have opposed cooperation of any kind with other church bodies, as a lowering of Reformed distinctiveness. But very few in America have maintained that such men should not be in a truly Reformed church. Even the professors have not been forthright enough to say that. They are willing that such should remain in the church, and that such should have liberty within the church, and that such should support the agencies of the church, plus institutions like Westminster Seminary and the Presbyterian Guardian. But they are not willing to see anyone whom they consider to be tainted with these errors to have any real influence in deciding the policy of the Westminster Seminary or the Presbyterian Guardian. That is why they are so afraid of letting the OPC have anything to say about the policy of these institutions. That is why they do not trust the OPC. That is why they are apparently willing to work and split the OPC rather than to permit it to have a say as to the education of its future ministers or a voice in the running of a magazine that is looked upon by many as an organ of the church. That is, he has this in caps now. That is apparently the reason why they have made the OPC feel that they would leave its membership if the issues they raised are not decided favorably. Allen's fourth letter, Consistency, May 5th, 1947, continued his critique of the Westminster faculty. He wrote, quote, "Consistency had a jewel-like quality when the professors pointed out the errors of modern dispensationalism, the errors and tendencies of fundamentalism in general," unquote. He continued, saying, "But it was a foolish consistency that caused them to take the stand that a church could not say that it was expedient to abstain from drinking alcoholic beverages. It was and is a foolish consistency to make hobgoblins out of men like McIntyre, Strong, Smith, Clark, Hamilton, and others. It is foolish consistency which compels men to go on the defensive and spend their lives and energies repelling as enemies those who want to be friends, whose enthusiasm and talents are needed in the common cause. It is foolish consistency which causes the best minds in our church to argue for 4 years without reaching a common understanding of the definition of terms. It is this foolish consistency which makes the professors unfit to exercise practical and inspirational leadership." Let's pause for a second here as you see so many people posting this picture of the Westminster Seminary professors from the beginning as if it was this grand cadre of men. And the more you study it, the more you realize there were serious problems. And there always has been serious problems at Westminster Seminary. It's not the bastion of orthodoxy that they wished it would be coming out of Princeton. In fact, has had changes all throughout and some very serious issues in this time in the 40s and 50s, as well as in later years. Let's continue then. In Allen's fifth letter, Militancy, May 12, 1947, he continued the critique, writing, "The professors of Westminster Seminary in the present controversy firmly believe they are standing where Dr. Machen would have them stand. I do not presume to know where Dr. Machen would stand in the Clark case, the Mahaffey case, the Ryan case, the Tickner case, the Gregory case, the Hamilton case. Only one of these was an official case, but the others were relentlessly grilled to ascertain whether or not they held to the alleged heresy or heresies of Dr. Clark. But I do know and unhesitatingly state that regardless of where he stood, he would not have become less militant against modernism than against Bible-believing Christians, particularly those who claimed to be Reformed and have suffered for what they considered the Reformed faith." The purpose of Allen's sixth and seventh letters, sent on the same day, was to garner support for the upcoming 14th General Assembly to vote against the Westminster professors. He writes on May 19, 1947, "The most important business at that assembly is, in my opinion, the election of members to the various standing committees of the church. These committees furnish leadership for the denomination in its mission and educational work. I do not think that it would serve the best interests of our church to have these committees dominated by the professors and those who apparently approve their policy 100%. Allen then reiterated his reasons for opposition from his previous letters and gives Clark's case as an example of the problem with the professors. Take the case of Dr. Clark. In the report on the doctrine of incomprehensibility, signed by Professors Stonehouse and Murray, there is an admission that the complainants erred in assuming that the teaching of Reformed theologians on the subject was uniform. There is also an admission that some of the statements of the complainants were infelicitous and misleading. But these men hold in the same report that Dr. Clark should have seen that in its main thrust, the complaint could not possibly have meant that man cannot know God. They are demanding of Dr. Clark and the men who wrote the answer to the complaint a discernment and charitable attitude, which, if they themselves had exercised the same attitude, would have spared the church the awful experience through which it is passing. They have treated and continue to treat former friends as the basest of heretics, and despite the admissions of the above mentioned report, they insist on making the so called Clark case a test of orthodoxy for ministers in the OPC. In my opinion, it would be catastrophic to continue such men in leadership. These 7 letters of Samuel Allen exemplify the lowest point of the situation in the OPC, resulting from the ordination controversy, and signaled the approaching dissolution of the church, which began not long after, with the departure of numerous pastors and congregations. The next section is the unraveling of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church and the continued debate. What Clark perceived as the WTS faction's obstructionist votes on Clark and Tickner's ordinations, on Hamilton's teaching in Korea, and in the Christian University Association, their skeptical epistemology, and that the OPC was infighting rather than leading the nation's fundamentalists, brought Clark to conclude that he could, quote, more effectively bring the truths of the Bible to human minds in another connection, unquote. On October 14, 1948, Clark left the OPC and joined the United Presbyterian Church, the denomination in which his grandfather had ministered. Clark was not the only casualty. Edwin Ryan had already left the OPC and returned to the PCUSA in 1947. Alan Tickner transferred, like Clark, to the United Presbyterian Church in 1948. Robert Strong, with his large congregation, Calvary Church in Willow Grove, Pennsylvania, left the OPC in 1949 for the Presbyterian Church, U.S. Floyd Hamilton joined the PCUS in 1955. Clark supporters Franklin Durnis and Richard Weiler Gray also left the denomination. All told, approximately 15% of congregations, ministers, and members left the OPC over matters related to the Clark case and Hamilton issue. Clark's reasons for leaving come to light in a letter he wrote on March 1st, 1948, 6 months prior to his actual departure from the OPC. In the letter, written to the directors of the Covenant House, a pro-Clark group in the OPC, first formed to publish gospel tracts, and who later published The Witness, Clark evidences that a, quote, sectarian party, unquote, had frequently attacked the American Presbyterian heritage, which the OPC was to continue per its founding as the, quote, true spiritual succession of the Presbyterian Church in the USA, unquote. Among these evidences of sectarianism, Clark cited a recent article in the Presbyterian Guardian, which referred to Arminianism and modernism as, quote, equally dangerous, unquote. Clark, however, believed that although Arminianism misinterprets Scripture on some important points, it still accepts the Bible, and that sincere Arminians are predestinated, all persevere in grace, and are perfectly sanctified in heaven. Modernism, on the other hand, Clark wrote, is dangerous because it denies the infallibility of the Bible. It denies the vicarious atonement of Christ, and ultimately leads to hell. In the sectarian party's grouping of these two errors, it grouped Christians and non-Christians, condemning them both. The sectarian party admitted there were mistakes in the complaint, but still had it published without correcting them. They also, according to Clark, attacked the character of Floyd Hamilton, which he found outrageous considering Hamilton's 20 years of service as a foreign missionary. Yet more than anything else, the sectarian party outraged Clark most severely in implying that, quote, the human mind can never know any truth whatsoever, unquote, and thus ultimately leading Clark to conclude that they were skeptics. Clark wrote this. Of course, the General Assembly has the legal right to choose who shall administer the affairs of the Church. But inasmuch as the sectarian party won such a victory, inasmuch as the General Assembly, after seeing clearly that it was faced with the definite choice between the two parties, chose the skeptics, there comes a question that we must ask and answer. Is it worthwhile to expend more energy trying to maintain the purpose for which the OPC was founded? Is there any hope in continuing with a group who prefer skepticism and slander to truth? Can we not better bring the truths of the Bible to human minds more effectively in some other connection? These are hard questions. The answers may be harder, but answers must be given shortly. Some of our friends have already decided. End quote. The departure of so many ministers and congregations from the already small OPC, and along with them much of the evangelistic zeal, essentially ended any likelihood of the denomination becoming a noticeable numerical presence on the American Christian landscape. This fracturing of the church left the OPC weak. During the 20th century, the OPC would have only slow growth, never having more than 30,000 members, while the liberal PCUSA continued as the most prominent national Presbyterian church. Now, the next section is called Misunderstandings and Confusion. There has been significant misunderstanding regarding the ordination controversy. For example, in William White's biography of Van Til, he writes, quote, "The ultimate outcome of the controversy was that, for better or worse, the complaint carried. But the complaint did not carry. Either this confusion stems from the fact that Clark left the church, making it appear as if the complaint carried, or from wishful thinking on White's behalf. In another case, a factual error was made by D.G. Hart and John Mather, who wrote, Clark was licensed to preach and ordained at the same meeting, indicating that his ordination process was rushed. But in truth, there was a month between Clark's licensing and ordination. Furthermore, Clark's application for ordination was more than 2 years prior to these events. His ordination was anything but rushed. The participants in the Clark case themselves were often confused. The documents presented at OPC General Assemblies were not actually solely authored by Clark and Van Til, respectively, but by representatives of their viewpoints. This can be likened to a proxy war. According to Robert Strong, quote, "One of the difficulties on this subject is that the opponents of Clark on the floor of Presbytery and in the drawing up of complaint did not include Cornelius Van Til. It was Van Til for whom they were speaking. It was his thought they were trying to express. It was essentially opposition between these two thinkers, Gordon H. Clark and Cornelius Van Til, which was coming to expression in the controversy. But not once did Van Til take the floor of Presbytery to speak, to explain, or to protest, and nothing came from his hand either about this issue." Unquote. According to the OPC General Assembly minutes, Van Til did not contribute to any of the study committees on the controversial doctrines. Rather, it was John Murray who championed the WTS faculty's position. In fact, because of this, Van Til's biographer, John Mather, has called the ordeal the, quote, Clark-Murray debate, unquote. Still, it was clear to Clark that Van Til was the impetus behind the complaint. Clark wrote, quote, "Dr. Van Til's views are obviously the philosophic background of the complaint," unquote. And again he wrote, quote, "It must be clear to anyone who has studied this document that its ideas and accusations are largely based on Dr. Van Til's views," unquote. Van Til later affirmed his involvement himself, writing, quote, "There was no one in the General Assembly who did not know that I had signed the text of a complaint against Clark," unquote. Even if Van Til didn't contribute to the study committees, he published 3 articles on common grace, perhaps I could add there, against Clark in the Westminster Theological Journal during the controversy. Some members of the Presbytery went along with the complaint, solely based on the reputation of those who made it, without understanding the doctrines involved. Referring to this fact, Clark wrote, quote, "The necessity of examining the philosophic background of the complaint is seen in the fact that certain members of the Assembly openly admitted that they did not understand the issues and accordingly based their votes on their confidence in the ability and scholarship of the complainants," unquote. Reverend Gray wrote similarly to Ned Stonehouse. Quote, as you and others virtually have put it, the theological reputation of the complainants has been at stake in this controversy. Men have admittedly stood with them because of their reputation. Unquote. Mentioning one of these men specifically, another elder involved commented, quote, at this point, I feel something like Bradford as he sat next to me at the July Presbytery meeting, twitching nervously. I don't know how to vote, so he voted for Clark. And when he felt uncomfortable there, he changed and signed the complaint. Unquote. Lest one think it was only in the direction of the complainants that reputation was a factor. It should be noted that Clark's reputation gained him backing as well. Ned Stonehouse pointed this out to another minister. Quote, one minister told me that the entire matter might be looked at in an entirely different light if only the status of Dr. Clark were not bound up with it. Unquote. Not only were the participants in the controversy confused, but according to John Frame, Clark and Van Til made mistakes as well. Frame wrote, quote, neither man was at his best in this discussion. Each seriously misunderstood the other. Taking the opposite of Frame's view that neither man was at his best, John Meether argues that Van Til's role in the controversy, far from being an embarrassment, should be interpreted as one of his finest moments. Meether praises Van Til's role, though he acknowledges that it was rather minimal, noting that, quote, most analyses tend to overstate Van Til's involvement in the debate. And, quote, not once did Van Til take the floor of Presbytery to speak, nor did he write anything during the controversy, nor did he serve on the General Assembly study committees, unquote. Sadly, it seems few ministers in the OPC approached the controversy in a balanced manner. From the outset, nearly every minister had chosen a camp, Clark or the WTS faculty, and never relented from their positions. The only known exception to this was the Reverend Edward F. Hills, who wrote letters to both Clark and the WTS faculty, calling attention to the underlying doctrinal unity which still exists in our church, and suggesting potential philosophical ways around the impasse. But Reverend Hill's suggestions, whether plausible or not, went unheeded. We then come to a section which I have titled Changes in the Position of the Complainants. The final salvo in the Clark case in the OPC was made at the 15th General Assembly in 1948, when reports from study committees were included in the minutes. A majority report written by Murray, Stonehouse, and Kuschke especially clarified the complaint, arguing that the complaint never intended to be skeptical or divide into two the content of knowledge of man and God. The majority report conceded Clark's major argument that not allowing for a connection between God's knowledge and man's knowledge would result in skepticism. The report read, quote, the second statement is also misleading, particularly because of the words single point. The whole clause, taken by itself, is liable to create the impression that our knowledge does not come into contact with the objects of the divine knowledge at any point. This would, of course, be incorrect and would also be skeptical in character, unquote. Yet, despite admitting the complaint's misleading character, the report concluded, quote, careful examination should have shown that the complaint was not contending for a qualitative distinction between the objects of knowledge known to man, or known to God and man, nor that a true proposition in its narrowest and minimal significance is qualitatively different for God, nor that a true proposition has one import or signification for God and another for man, nor that man can have no cognitive contact with the objects of divine knowledge, but rather was contending for a qualitative distinction in some other respect, namely what the complaint denotes as content, distinguished from mode on the other hand, and from the truth known on the other. Hence, we conclude that, though the complaint failed in the matter of clear definition and lucidity, it is not defensible to charge it with error in the direction of skepticism, unquote. It seems that the complainants felt the weight of Clark's criticism and their position results in skepticism, and in the wake of this critique modified their position. This modification was made in two ways. One, a changed definition of content, and two, an acceptance of a point of contact, which at the start of the controversy had been categorically denied. In order to maintain that their position, in fact, did not entail skepticism, it is evident that the complainants changed their definition of content in the time between the complaint, 1944, and the majority report in 1948. The majority report explained content as distinct from object. It read, "It is not with the objects of knowledge the complaint is concerned, but with the difference between the character of God's understanding and man's understanding, even when the same object is contemplated." Thus, in the majority report, that thing beyond object with which they were concerned, the content, was taken to mean the character of understanding. But in the complaint, content had meant the very item of knowledge itself in the mind. In the mind. In a majority report, Floyd Hamilton raised a red flag that this change of definition had occurred. First, Hamilton pointed out that the crucial definitional question is that of content, which the complainants insist is qualitatively different for man and for God. Next, he argued that the complaint had used content to mean the items of knowledge in the mind. He wrote, quote, "In the complaint itself, the meaning of the term is the things which the knowledge of God contains, i.e., the truths of his mind. Having stated as the proposition to be proved that Dr. Clarke denies a qualitative difference between the contents of the knowledge of God and the contents of the knowledge possible to man, the complaint proceeds to adduce evidence by asserting first that Dr. Clarke assumes that truth, whether in the divine mind or in the human mind, is always propositional. The trouble is, the argument asserts that on this assumption, there is no single item of knowledge in God's mind which may not be shared by the human mind." Unquote. Clarke understood the complaint's meaning of content just as Hamilton did. He wrote, quote, "The important question arises, what are the contents of one's knowledge? Obviously, the contents of one's knowledge are the truths one knows. The contents of God's knowledge are the truths he knows, and the contents of a man's knowledge are the truth the man knows. The complaint maintains that these two sets of truths are qualitatively different." Unquote. Given the original definition of content as items of knowledge, or the truths one knows, Clarke's critique of the position of the complaint was devastating. To avoid this result, content was changed to mean, quote, "character of understanding" in the 1948 majority report. But what character is this meant to refer to? One character of knowledge is its truth value, that is, whether it is true or false. In this respect, if the character of man's knowledge is different from God's knowledge, and God's knowledge is true, then man's knowledge can only be false. Alternatively, character of understanding perhaps is meant to be the way in which one knows. But the way of knowing must, it seems, be the same as mode, and Clarke's distinction of mode was deemed insufficient in the complaint. Based on the complainant's new definition of content, the original complaint no longer made sense. Though the report changed the definition of content, Van Til later refused to define it at all. In response to the answer's request that the complainants state clearly what the qualitative difference is, or what is meant by content, Van Til wrote this, quote, "Suppose now that the complainant should try to state clearly, in Dr. Clarke's sense, the qualitative difference between the divine and human knowledge of the proposition that 2 times 2 is 4. They would have to first deny their basic contention with respect to the Christian concept of revelation. It is precisely because they are concerned to defend the Christian doctrine of revelation as basic to all intelligible human predication that they refuse to make any attempt at stating clearly any Christian doctrine." I'd like to see that in an examination. I refuse to state clearly any Christian doctrine. That's probably not going to fly. Okay. The second change in the position occurred in 1948, when a letter of retraction signed by the original signers of the complaint was sent out to the church. In a key paragraph, it read, quote, "Since certain expressions used in the complaint have been understood as skeptical in character, and since the complaint cannot disavow all responsibility for producing such misunderstandings of its intent, We gladly affirm that when the objects of knowledge are contemplated, human knowledge does have contact with the objects of divine knowledge within the compass of the divine revelation, and that within the sphere of revelation, the objects of knowledge as such are the same for God and man. End quote. This admission was a far cry from the complaint's original statement that, quote, we dare not maintain that God's knowledge and our knowledge coincide at any point, unquote. In fact, that the admission that the objects of knowledge are as such are the same for God and man is nothing other than a complete reversal of the original position. In 1949, just a year after the Clark case, Van Til made his first and only official foray into the controversy, writing about the issues in his syllabus, An Introduction to Systematic Theology. In the syllabus, he affirmed that his views agreed with the complaint, but he took the retraction from the 1948 letter a step further. He elaborated, quote, in the first place, it is possible in this way to see that the knowledge of God and the knowledge of man coincide at every point, in the sense that always and everywhere man confronts that which he is already fully known or interpreted by God. The point or reference cannot but be the same for man as for God. There is no fact that man meets in any of his investigation where the face of God does not confront him. On the other hand, in this way, it is possible to see that the knowledge of God and the knowledge of man coincide at no point, in the sense that his awareness of meaning of anything, in his mental grasp or understanding of anything, man is at each point dependent upon a prior act of unchanging understanding and revelation on the part of God. Unquote. Van Til thus clarified in which sense he believed there is a point of contact, and in which sense he believed there is not. But because the complaint was clear and adamant on affirming that there was no point of contact in any sense, the conclusion that Van Til's view changed, or that the complaint, written by others yet signed by Van Til, uh, the conclusion must be that that never adequately reflected his views in the first place. Van Til's 1949 syllabus argued that the qualitative distinction between man's knowledge and God's knowledge is that the former is dependent and the latter independent. It seems unlikely that Clark would have found much difficulty in agreeing with this formulation. In fact, the dependency or dependent nature of man's knowledge on God's knowledge was precisely Clark's position from the beginning. It seems by 1949, Van Til had almost come fully around to Clark's position. Having admitted to Clark's view, but needing something against Clark to justify the complaint, Van Til took Clark's univocism, by which Clark meant a point of contact, to mean that Clark thought of man as autonomous, capable of knowing apart from God. Van Til wrote that Clark overlooks that it is little possible to reach the transcendent God of Christianity by means of Aristotelian logic. Clark's presuppositionalism, however, never held that such logic based proof of God was possible. In fact, it was a key tenet of Clark's views that God's existence cannot be determined by so called proofs made by man, but rather that knowledge of God is innate in man's mind and that his existence is assumed rather than proven in the Bible. Van Til concluded, continued saying that, quote, Dr. Clark understood the incomprehensibility of God in a way which would be in accord with the Romanist or Arminian view of it, and out of accord with the Reformed view of it, unquote. And that Clark, quote, seems to hold that man may obtain a certain amount of information about God apart from revelation. Presumably, this knowledge is to be obtained by reason operating independently of revelation, unquote. Van Til so obviously misunderstood Clark on these points that John Frame wrote, quote, I must say that I find this criticism of Clark quite preposterous, unquote. And, quote, again, I am rather shocked at Van Til's distortion of Clark's position, unquote. Frame concludes, quote, it would have been more helpful if Van Til, like the report, had straightforwardly conceded Clark's point that there is such common meaning, quote, end quote. Lots of quotes, end quotes. and I think this is the last section of the chapter. There's a couple more pages. This is probably the most difficult chapter, and if you're hearing it here, then maybe you should buy the book and read it more slowly as you look at this issue. I'm thinking this is the end discussion essentially in this book of anything on this debate over incomprehensibility. But I believe that I've more thoroughly covered this topic than anything else has in the past. Um, and maybe that's too thorough for some people who would rather read more exciting things. But what could be more exciting than the incomprehensibility of God? Okay, last section. Propositional truth. The reports presented in 1948 at the OPC's 15th General Assembly did not end the debate. In addition to Van Til's syllabus in 1949, there was an article by Clarke in 1957 titled The Bible as Truth. In this article, Clarke clarified that his position is that all truth is propositional. Because of the lack of clarity in the transcript of Clarke's original examination, Edmund Clowney and the committee to review Clarke's theology in the General Assembly seem to have prematurely dismissed the charge made against Clarke on this issue. The complaint made the accusation that, quote, the fundamental assumption made by Dr. Clarke is that truth, whether in the divine mind or the human mind, is always propositional, end quote. But the report of Clowney and the committee denied this accusation, saying, quote, the committee feels that, in all justice, this allegation cannot be regarded as completely accurate representation of Dr. Clarke's views, as they are expressed in the transcript. It is evident from the record that Dr. Clarke ascribes a propositional character to the truth in the human mind. He declares, I would not know what the word truth meant unless as a quality of a proposition. I cannot conceive of anything that is a truth that is not a proposition. But it is by no means evident from the record that Dr. Clarke ascribes a propositional character to God's knowledge, end quote. Yet it seems from his original examination answer that Clarke did believe God's knowledge to be propositional. But apparently this was not inferred by Clowney and the committee, and so they denied the accusation of the complaint on this point. Alternatively, perhaps Clowney was speaking to the manner of God's knowledge, not its object. The position of Clarke in The Bible as Truth was essentially the same as his in the theological examination. He believed all truth, whether known by God or man, to be propositional. Had Clowney and the committee found that Clarke's position was that God's knowledge, as well as man's, was propositional, one wonders what they might have concluded. However, even if Clowney would have agreed with the complainant's accusation, it is hard to see what repercussions this would have had, either in the report or in the theology itself. Does thinking of God's knowledge as propositional unjustly reduce God to human dimensions? Does such thinking fall prey to arguments made famous by Ludwig Feuerbach that man has created God in man's image? Ultimately, Clarke felt that the burden of proof was on the Westminster professors to give evidence for the existence of, quote, non-propositional truth, unquote, and suggested that it may be, quote, a phrase without meaning, unquote. There's a classic Clarkeism, a phrase without meaning. Conclusion of chapter 8. Perhaps the best summary of the whole controversy, commenting on its almost complete futility, was made by Reverend Strong, who wrote, quote, this controversy was unfortunate. It wasted a great many men's time, but perhaps value does attach to the exploration of the subject of incomprehensibility. One hopes that some benefits have accrued, unquote. Despite the controversy and all the personal pain which must have resulted, Clarke was able to joke about the situation, writing to J. Oliver Boswell, quote, is it not amusing that you and Van Til and I think severally that the other two are hopelessly confused? End quote. And that's the end of the chapter. You can see from that quote that Clarke continued to take things like this fairly well, considering it to be a philosophic debate, not a personal one. And his discussions with Boswell in the letters and presumably in life, while they disagreed on many subjects, they remained friends, as far as I know, to the end. I think Clarke and Boswell letters last for many years. They trail off somewhat um, later, and Boswell dies earlier than Clark. I'd like to know more about Boswell, especially his later years, whether he had a quick descent or a slow one. I'm not even sure how Boswell died, but I believe that that is a great topic. If anyone's interested in writing a biography, um, the PCA Historical Society in St. Louis has a lot of material on Boswell, sufficient, I believe, to write a biography. And I think it would be an interesting enough subject to do it on, as you see the connections there with the various institutions Boswell worked for, and history in the Bible Presbyterian Church, and with the Covenant Seminary and college, I think, as well at the time in St. Louis. So I continue to recommend people to consider writing on Boswell. I don't think I'll do it myself. I did talk with a man a while ago writing a biography on Robert Rayburn Sr., and I hope that will go well, that we'll learn much about 20th century American Presbyterianism from that study as well. So there are definitely big characters in this field whose stories remain to be written. So I always recommend, especially to students, if you're at a seminary or have that opportunity to do the deep research, you can really learn a lot from such a survey of a person's life and thought, and a survey of the history through which they went. So I think that is about it for today. I usually like to have some remarks about the world or things here. Not a whole lot to say. It's summertime for us, so the hikers continue to come regularly through our mission. I think I might have shown last time that we have new patches for our mission, so all of our donors will be receiving those in the fall. Just ask that you pray for our mission, Sola Appalachian Christian Retreat. Pray for our church, Unionville Presbyterian, for the denomination, the Bible Presbyterian Church, and for all the work of the faith to be done throughout the world. And there is much, much work. I'm in a village of a little over 600 people, and I think something like a 5% attendance rate at churches. And so we pray for this village and the people regularly, and the people in our area, as we pray for the growth of this church and care about their souls. So I perhaps should use this opportunity as well to recommend that you do find a church and get involved there. It's been somewhat of a concern of mine with people who like Dr. Clark's works that they haven't been always active in churches. And so I encourage you to not only study theology, but to practice it as well, worshiping the Lord in the church as we are requested to do in the scriptures in numerous places, that we should not divorce ourselves from the church. So let us obey the commands of God to obey our elders. And if we are to obey our elders, we must have them, which means you must be a member of a church. So let us seek to do the Lord's will in all things. Praise be to God. I'll sign off with that. God bless.